The smell of hot asphalt hit me before I even reached the end of my driveway. At 5:43 on a Tuesday morning, a diesel engine was roaring beside my property line, and a crew of men in orange vests was spreading fresh black pavement over the gravel road I owned. The sound stopped me cold. That road wasn't a neighborhood street. It wasn't a community entrance. It wasn't anyone's shortcut. It was the private access road I paid for when I bought my 12-acre property outside Fort Collins, Colorado, and someone was turning it into something else. I stepped out of my truck and felt loose gravel crunch beneath my boots before my eyes adjusted to what I was seeing. The old gray stones that had been there for years were disappearing under a layer of steaming asphalt. The sharp smell of tar mixed with diesel fumes filled the air. A compact roller machine crawled forward, vibrating the ground under my feet like it was rewriting the land itself. Then I saw the gate. A brand new black iron gate stood where my driveway met the subdivision entrance. It wasn't there yesterday. Bolted across the top was a polished metal sign. Pine Ridge Estates Community Access Road. I stared at it for a few seconds because my brain refused to accept what my eyes were showing me. Someone hadn't just used my road. Someone had renamed it. "Can I help you?" The voice came from behind me. Victoria Harrow stood beside a white SUV, holding a clipboard and wearing the same confident smile people use when they already believe they've won. She wasn't surprised to see me. She wasn't confused. She looked like she had been waiting. "Yeah," I said, pointing toward the construction equipment. "You can explain why your HOA is paving my road." Vicky tilted her head slightly. "Our road improvement project," she corrected. That one word told me everything. "Our." I walked closer, keeping my voice steady. "This road is part of my property." She opened the clipboard and pulled out a packet of papers. "Ethan, everyone has been using this access route for 18 years. At some point, it stopped being private." The way she said it bothered me more than the construction. Not because she was angry, because she sounded certain. Like she had repeated that sentence so many times she no longer questioned whether it was true. I looked past her toward the workers. One of them was moving a pile of old gravel aside with a loader. Mixed in with the rocks were pieces of broken orange plastic. My survey marker. I had placed those markers when I bought the property 6 years earlier. They marked the edge of my access line. They weren't decorative. They weren't optional. They told everyone where my land ended and someone else's began. I walked over and picked up one of the broken pieces. "What happened here?" Vicky barely glanced at it. "Old markers get moved during improvements." That answer bothered me, because she didn't ask what marker I meant. She already knew. I took out my phone and started recording. Not because I wanted to fight. I had spent most of my life avoiding them. I owned a small construction company. I fixed problems for a living. But I had learned something from years of dealing with contractors, inspectors, and property lines. When something feels wrong, document first. I recorded the equipment, the gate, the sign, and the workers. Then I asked the foreman for the authorization documents. He wiped his hands on his jeans and looked uncomfortable. "I'm just following the work order," he said. "From who?" He looked toward Vicky. That was when she stepped forward and handed me a printed page. At the top was the Pine Ridge Estates HOA logo. Below, it was a project title, Community Infrastructure Upgrade, Road Conversion Initiative. Road conversion. Not repair. Not maintenance. Conversion. I folded the paper and looked back at the gate. 6 years earlier, I bought this place because I wanted distance. Quiet. A piece of land where I could build something without a committee deciding what belonged to me. My wife Megan loved the property because of that road. Every evening, we could sit on the porch and hear nothing except whine through the trees and tires rolling over gravel. Now someone had covered that gravel before sunrise, and they were acting like they had every right. Vicky climbed into her SUV and rolled down the window. "Ethan, I'd suggest you cooperate. Fighting the community won't end well." Then she drove away, leaving the smell of fresh asphalt hanging in the morning air. I looked down at the broken orange survey marker still sitting in my hand. Then I looked back at the new gate. Because suddenly, the question wasn't why they paved my road. The question was, who convinced them they owned it? I spent the rest of that morning doing what I always do when something doesn't make sense. I checked the details. The first thing I did was walk the entire length of the road with my phone in one hand and a measuring tape in the other. The fresh asphalt was still warm enough that my boots left faint marks on the surface. Every few yards, I stopped and photographed the edges, the drainage ditch, and the places where the old gravel disappeared under the new pavement. The orange survey marker pieces were still bothering me. Someone had not accidentally damaged one marker. Someone had cleared the exact area where those markers were visible. That was a decision. When I got back to the house, Megan was standing on the porch holding 2 cups of coffee. She looked past me toward the road. "Tell me that's not what I think it is." I handed her the photo of the new gate. "It's worse," I said. The metal sign bothered her too. Not because it was ugly, because it looked official. That was the trick. It wasn't just a piece of metal attached to a fence. It was a message. It told anyone who drove by that Pine Ridge Estates controlled that road. And people believe signs. Over the next few days, I started asking questions. Not angry questions. Simple ones. I called the county transportation office and asked whether there had been any road ownership changes connected to my property. The person on the phone searched for several minutes, then told me the county had records showing the road as an access route. But when I asked who owned it, there was a pause. A longer pause than I expected. "I'd have to check that," the employee said. That answer stayed with me. An access route, not an owned road. I wrote it down. Then I drove to the HOA office. Pine Ridge Estates kept its operations in a small brick building near the neighborhood entrance. Inside, everything looked polished. Framed community awards covered the walls. A large map of the subdivision hung behind the reception desk. And right there, highlighted in yellow marker, was my road. I noticed it before I even sat down. "Nice map," I said. Vicky looked up from her computer. She smiled. "I thought you'd come by." Of course she did. She had a folder waiting. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a reaction. It was preparation. She opened the folder and slid several pages across the desk. The first page was a notice about the road improvement project. The second was a breakdown of costs. The third caught my attention. A community maintenance assessment. My name was already listed. I looked at the number. $2,400. "You bill me for this?" Vicky folded her hands. "The road benefits everyone. It's only fair that everyone contributes." I stared at the paper. The asphalt was less than a week old, and somehow they had already decided I owed them money for putting it there. "I never approved this." "You don't need to approve every community decision," she said. That sentence was delivered calmly, almost politely, but it carried the same assumption as the gate, that they had already decided where my rights ended. I took photos of every page before leaving. Outside, I noticed something else. A small black camera mounted on a wooden post near the road entrance. It wasn't pointed toward the neighborhood. It was pointed directly at my driveway. I walked closer. The camera was new. Fresh screws. Fresh holes in the wood. Someone had installed it after the paving started. When I got home, I checked my mailbox. A thick envelope was waiting inside. The paper was heavier than a normal notice. The HOA logo was printed across the top. Inside was a formal letter informing me that Pine Ridge Estates had begun the process of formalizing community access rights for the road. I read that sentence 3 times. They weren't asking permission. They weren't discussing maintenance. They were building a case. And buried near the bottom of the letter was one line that made my stomach tighten. The HOA claimed the county had already recognized the road as part of Pine Ridge Estates infrastructure. But the county employee I spoke with had never said that. They had only said one thing. The road existed. They never said it belonged to anyone. I looked back toward the gate at the end of my property. The sign was still shining in the afternoon sun. And now I knew something important. The gate, the cameras, the assessment, and the paperwork were not separate moves. They were pieces of the same plan. The only thing I still didn't know was who had given them permission to build it. The next morning, I called Daniel Ruiz. I had known Daniel for years through my construction work. He wasn't the kind of guy who looked for problems. He was the kind of guy who found them because he knew where to look. He showed up at my property just after sunrise with a field bag, a laser range finder, and the same serious expression he wore every time someone said, "I think the measurements are close enough." They usually weren't. We walked the road from my driveway to the subdivision entrance. The new asphalt made everything look cleaner. That was the problem. Fresh pavement hides old mistakes. Daniel crouched near the edge of the road where the gravel shoulder met the new black surface. He brushed away loose dirt with his glove and looked underneath. Interesting. I already knew that word from him. Interesting never meant good. What? He pointed toward the ground. The road edge is about 2 feet wider on this side than the old access path. I looked down. The difference was small. Most people would never notice it. But Daniel did. A wider road meant a wider claim. They weren't just improving the road. They were expanding the footprint. We kept walking until we reached the entrance where the new gate stood. The orange survey marker I had found broken 2 days earlier was gone. Not buried. Not damaged. Gone. Daniel checked the area carefully. Then he stopped beside one of the new concrete bases supporting the gate. Ethan. I walked over. Under the edge of the concrete, barely visible, was a small piece of orange plastic. Another survey marker. They had poured the gate foundation right over it. Daniel took a picture. They knew this was here, he said. I felt that same pressure building in my chest. Not anger. Something colder. Planning. We drove back to his office with copies of the photos and the HOA documents I had collected. Daniel pulled up 2 maps on his computer. The first was the county access map. The second was the HOA community map. At a glance, they looked almost identical. But when Daniel layered them together, the differences appeared. The county map showed a narrow access corridor. The HOA map showed a much larger road area extending into my property. They changed the boundary line, Daniel said. Can they do that? He leaned back. Not because they draw it on a map. That was the first real piece of the puzzle. The HOA wasn't operating from ownership. They were operating from assumption. But I still needed to know where that assumption came from. That afternoon, I called the previous owner of my property, Thomas Whitaker. I had only spoken with him a few times after buying the land. He was 71, retired, and the kind of man who remembered every fence post he had ever installed. When I explained what happened, there was a long silence. You said they paved the road? Yeah. Another pause. That road was never sold. The words hit harder than I expected. What do you mean? Tom sighed. Back in the late 80s, the developer asked for access. The agreement was simple. They could use the road to reach the subdivision. But using something and owning something are 2 different things. I wrote that sentence down, because that difference suddenly mattered. Before we hung up, Tom told me something else. There should still be a copy of the original access agreement in the county records. That night, I reviewed everything again. The gate, the camera, the assessment, the expanded road, the broken markers. None of it looked like a misunderstanding anymore. It looked like someone had taken a temporary right of access and slowly transformed it into a claim of ownership. The next morning, Daniel called me. His voice sounded different, more serious. I found the original filing. I grabbed a notebook. What does it say? A pause. Then he answered. The agreement gives Pine Ridge access rights to use the road. I waited. And Daniel looked at the document again. It never transferred the road. I stared at the papers in front of me. For the first time since the asphalt machines arrived, I had something real. Not a feeling, not a suspicion, a fact. But Daniel wasn't finished. There's one more thing, he said. What? The HOA has been reporting this road to the county as community infrastructure for years. I looked toward the window, toward the gate they had built on my land, and I realized the problem was no longer just that they used my road. The bigger question was how long they had been telling everyone it belonged to them. The day after Daniel showed me the access agreement, the tone around Pine Ridge changed. Not loudly. That was the part that bothered me. Vicky Harrow was too smart to throw a tantrum. She didn't storm onto my property or send angry messages. She went quiet. And people who go quiet after losing control usually aren't giving up. They're planning. The first sign came at 6:15 the next morning. I was loading equipment into my work truck when a security vehicle rolled slowly down my road. Not a police cruiser. Not a county vehicle. A private security SUV with Pine Ridge Estates printed on the door. The driver stopped beside my driveway and lowered the window. Morning. Just verifying access. I looked at the logo on his door. Access to what? He glanced at his clipboard. The community access road. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started recording. I'm documenting this conversation. His expression changed slightly. Not fear. Training. I'm just following instructions, sir. That sentence told me everything. Someone had prepared him for this. I asked him who authorized the patrols. He pointed toward the HOA entrance. Management. I recorded the vehicle, the license plate, and the time. A small decision. Nothing dramatic. But after what happened with the survey markers, I had started documenting everything. Every conversation. Every vehicle. Every change. I didn't know yet how important that habit would become. 2 days later, my first construction client called. It was a paving job outside town that my company had been preparing for 3 months. Ethan, I need to talk about the access issue. I knew immediately what he meant. What access issue? He hesitated. The HOA situation near your property. Someone told my project manager there was an ongoing dispute involving your company equipment. I felt my jaw tighten. Who told him that? He didn't answer directly. He didn't need to. By the end of the call, I lost the contract. Not because I did bad work. Not because I missed deadlines. Because someone had made my business look unstable. That hurt more than I expected. My company was built on trust. A contractor's reputation is like concrete. It takes years to pour, minutes to crack. When I got home, Megan was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of mail. You need to see this. The envelope was from the HOA attorney. Inside was a formal notice claiming I was interfering with community infrastructure improvements. They demanded that I stop making unauthorized objections to road operations. Unauthorized objections. That was their wording. They had turned me questioning their actions into me causing the problem. Then came the part that made me put the paper down. They were requesting reimbursement for delays caused by the property owner. They were trying to make me financially responsible for the project they started without my permission. That afternoon, I walked outside and inspected the road again. The camera was still there. The gate was still locked in place. But something new had appeared. A small wooden sign beside the entrance. Private community road. Authorized users only. I stared at it. Because that sign wasn't just a message. It was enforcement. The next morning, one of my company trucks arrived with materials for a small job on my property. The security guard stepped in front of it. Sorry, I need to verify authorization. My authorization is owning the property. He looked uncomfortable. I understand, sir. But I have orders. I watched my driver turn the truck around. A full load of material I had already paid for sat and used while my schedule slipped another day. That evening, Vicky sent an email to all Pine Ridge residents. She described the situation as a misunderstanding caused by one homeowner refusing to cooperate with necessary community improvements. She never mentioned the missing transfer. She never mentioned the access agreement. She never mentioned the survey markers. She made it sound like I was the obstacle. Then, 3 days later, the HOA filed the document that changed everything. They officially requested county recognition of Pine Ridge Estates community access rights over my road. The fight was no longer about asphalt. They had just moved to make their version of the story permanent. The county hearing was scheduled 3 weeks after Pine Ridge filed its request. 3 weeks was enough time for a story to spread. And Vicky Harrow knew exactly how to tell it. By the time we walked into the county building, most people in that room already believed they understood what happened. They saw the expensive new road. They saw the HOA signs. They saw the neighborhood association claiming responsibility. And they saw me as the homeowner fighting against something everyone else had already accepted. That was the hardest part. Not the paperwork. Not the arguments. The looks. The quiet judgment from people who had never stepped onto my property, but had already decided I was the problem. Vicky sat at the front table wearing a calm expression, surrounded by HOA board members and their attorney. She looked prepared. I looked tired. Because I was. My company had taken a hit. The contract I lost wasn't just a number on a spreadsheet. It was a crew that needed hours. It was equipment sitting unused. It was bills that didn't stop just because someone decided to turn my road into a political fight. The worst part was watching my own driveway become a place where I had to ask permission. The security guard was still there every morning. The gate still stood. The camera still watched. My own road felt like someone else's checkpoint. During the hearing, Vicky spoke first. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. The HOA has maintained this access route for nearly 2 decades, she said. We have invested significant funds into preserving and improving it for the community. That sentence was carefully built. Not one lie anyone could easily point to. They had maintained it. They had spent money. People had used it. But she left out the one thing that mattered. Who owned it? When my turn came, I presented the access agreement. I showed the survey photos. I explained the difference between using a road and owning one. But the county official reviewing the case didn't make a final decision that day. Instead, he said the county needed additional time to evaluate the historical use and current access situation. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't a loss. But for Vicky, it was enough. The next morning, Pine Ridge sent a notice to every resident. Temporary continuation of community access approved. That was the headline. Not ownership disputed. Not records under review. Just enough truth arranged in the right order to make people believe they had won. Then my phone started ringing. Neighbors who used to wave at me stopped. One person told me I was hurting the neighborhood. Another said I should just let the community have the road. Like it was theirs to begin with. The financial damage kept growing. The construction project I lost never came back. My supplier called and asked if everything was okay because rumors were spreading that my business was involved in a property dispute. I spent that evening sitting at my kitchen table with unpaid invoices spread out in front of me. Megan sat across from me. For the first time since this started, she looked worried. Are we sure this is worth it? I looked toward the window. The gate was visible in the distance. A black shape cutting across the end of my driveway. I don't know, I admitted. And that was the hardest thing I had said since this began. The next day, I walked the road alone. I wanted to see what had changed. Near the entrance, I noticed the HOA camera mounted on the wooden post. The little red indicator light was blinking. I looked closer. A small inspection sticker was attached underneath. The date caught my attention. It was installed the same week the HOA claimed the county had already recognized the road. I took a picture. Then I noticed something else. The camera wasn't just pointed at the road. It was pointed at the old property entrance marker, the one they had covered with the gate foundation. I stood there for a long time, because suddenly, their victory looked different. They hadn't installed that camera to protect a road. They installed it to watch something specific, something they knew mattered. I looked back at the gate, the camera, and the fresh pavement. For the first time in weeks, losing didn't feel like the end. It felt like they had just shown me where they were most afraid of looking. I went back to Daniel's office the next morning with one question. Not how do we fight this? Not how do we prove they're wrong? Just one question. What exactly were they trying to protect with that camera? Daniel pulled up the photos I had taken. The camera, the gate, the concrete base, the covered survey marker. He zoomed in until the image became grainy. There, he said. I leaned closer. The camera wasn't centered on the road. It was positioned slightly off. Almost like whoever installed it cared less about watching traffic and more about watching one specific point. The old property entrance. The same area where the original marker had disappeared. Daniel printed the photo. Then he placed it beside the old survey picture from when I bought the property. 2 images. 6 years apart. Same location. Different reality. In my original photo, the orange survey marker stood clearly beside the gravel road. In the new photo, the same spot was buried beneath the gate foundation. They didn't remove a random marker, Daniel said. They removed the one that showed where the road actually ended. I sat there quietly, because that changed something. The broken marker wasn't just damage. It was part of the story. I spent the afternoon going through every file I had saved since the first morning. The video of the construction crew, the HOA assessment, the community map, the county access record, the camera installation date. I created copies on 2 separate drives and stored one away from my house. I had learned something from Vicky. People who control information control the argument. I wasn't going to let that happen again. The next step was checking the dates. That was when I found the first real crack. The HOA paperwork said the community infrastructure project began in March, but the contractor invoice attached to their own assessment showed something different. The preparation work started 2 weeks earlier, before the HOA announced the project, before residents were notified, before anyone outside the board knew anything was happening. I called Daniel. Look at these dates. He opened the files and went quiet. They were planning this before they told anyone. Exactly. That still didn't prove ownership, but it proved something important. This wasn't a neighborhood improvement that got complicated. This was a decision that had already been made. Then I called Thomas Whitaker again. I asked him about the original access agreement. This time, I asked a different question. Did the developer ever ask to buy the road? Thomas laughed softly. No, they didn't want to buy it. Why not? Because they didn't need to. The agreement gave them access. That was the whole point. A simple answer, but it explained everything. For years, Pine Ridge had benefited from access without needing ownership. At some point, someone decided those 2 things meant the same thing. And Vicky built an entire system around that assumption. The final piece came from the county. I submitted a formal request for the historical records connected to the road. Not a complaint, not an accusation, a verification request. I wanted the county to answer one specific question. Was there ever a transfer of ownership? While I waited, I drove past the entrance every morning. The gate was still there. The sign was still there. Vicky still believed she had won. That was almost the strange part. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't nervous. She was acting like the paperwork, the cameras, and the pavement had already rewritten history. But history doesn't change because someone installs a gate. It changes because the records support it. 3 days later, I received confirmation from the county. They scheduled an official ownership review. I printed the notice, placed it beside the original access agreement, then beside the photo of the buried survey marker. For the first time in weeks, the pieces were finally sitting in the same place. I didn't tell Vicky what I had found. I didn't send a warning. I didn't make a public statement. I simply forwarded the evidence package to the county reviewer and requested a field inspection of the road boundaries. The same road they had paved, the same road they had claimed, the same road they had never actually proven was theirs. The county inspector arrived at 9 a.m. on a Thursday. I was already standing near the gate when his truck pulled in. The same gate that had been installed before anyone asked me. The same gate that had changed the way people looked at my own property. Daniel arrived a few minutes later with his survey equipment. He carried the same field bag he always used, but this time there was something different in the air. This wasn't another conversation. This was the moment where assumptions met measurements. Vicky arrived in her white SUV exactly on time. Of course she did. She stepped out wearing a navy blazer, carrying a folder, and looking completely comfortable. That was the thing about Vicky. She never acted like someone defending a mistake. She acted like someone protecting a victory. "Ethan," she said with a polite smile, "I hope we can finally put this misunderstanding behind us." I looked at the county inspector, then at the gate, then back at her. "Me too." She smiled wider. I don't think she heard the difference in those words. The inspector walked the property line first. Daniel followed. They measured the road width, checked the old access corridor, and compared the physical markers with the recorded maps. I stayed quiet. That was intentional. For weeks, Vicky had been fighting my words. Today, I wanted her own words to matter more. After about 20 minutes, the inspector stopped near the concrete base of the gate. He looked down. "Was this installed recently?" Vicky answered immediately. "Yes, as part of our community access improvement project." Not their project. Not a neighborhood project. Their community access improvement project. Daniel looked at me briefly. I said nothing. The inspector wrote something down. Then he asked, "Who authorized the placement of this structure?" Vicky opened her folder. "We did. Pine Ridge Estates has maintained this access route for 18 years. Again, the same phrase, the same confidence. She handed him a document, a printed statement from the HOA. I recognized it. It was the same claim they had repeated since the beginning. Community infrastructure, established access, long-term control. But now it was being handed to a county official. On record, the inspector read it carefully. "Does the HOA own this road?" Vicky didn't hesitate. "Yes." The air felt different after that. Not dramatic, just quiet. Because that was the first time she had said it directly. Not implied it, not suggested it, confirmed it. Daniel slowly lowered his measuring equipment. The inspector looked back at his paperwork. "Do you have a recorded transfer?" Vicky gave a small smile. "The community has used this road for nearly 2 decades. The county has treated it as our infrastructure." That wasn't my question. Her smile faded slightly. Only slightly. She opened another folder. "We have maintenance records, improvement costs, and years of community use." The inspector nodded. "I understand. But I'm asking about ownership transfer." A gust of wind moved across the road. The new sign above the gate rattled softly against the metal frame. That sound reminded me of the first morning. The asphalt, the machines, the orange marker buried under concrete. The thing they thought nobody would notice. Vicky looked at me. "You've spent months creating confusion over something the entire neighborhood understands." There it was. The argument she had always believed. If enough people accepted something, it became true. She turned back toward the inspector. "We are simply trying to preserve what has existed for years." The inspector looked at the camera mounted beside the gate. The same camera I had photographed. The same camera installed before the review. Was this camera installed by the HOA? Vicky nodded. "Yes, for community security. And it monitors this entrance?" "Yes." The inspector looked down at the ground near the concrete base. Then he checked the measurements Daniel provided. A small crease appeared between his eyebrows. "Interesting. That word. The same word Daniel used when something was wrong." The inspector asked for the installation date. Vicky provided it. March 14th. Exactly the date shown in the HOA records. Exactly the date before they claimed the county had recognized their infrastructure. She thought the dates proved preparation. She didn't realize they proved something else. The inspector collected copies of every document. The HOA statement, the installation record, the maintenance file, the map. Then he turned to Vicky. I need the original ownership transfer document before this review can continue. Vicky looked confident, almost relieved. Of course. She reached into her folder, then stopped. Just for a second. That tiny pause was the first crack I had seen. Because there was nothing in that folder. No deed. No transfer. No signature. No record. Only years of people believing the same thing. The inspector closed his notebook. Daniel looked at me. I looked at the camera, the gate, the buried marker, and the statement Vicky had just signed with her own confidence. For weeks, I had been searching for the piece that connected everything. The missing link between the road, the claim, and the story they had built. Now it was sitting in the inspector's hands. And Vicky still thought she had cornered me. She didn't know what she had just given us. The first thing the county did was separate what everyone assumed from what the records actually showed. That was the moment the room changed. For weeks, Pine Ridge had been telling people the same story. The road had been used for 18 years. The HOA had maintained it. The county had recognized it. Therefore, it belonged to them. But the county inspector placed 3 pages on the table and quietly removed the first brick from that argument. The county records show maintenance activity, he said. They do not show ownership transfer. Nobody spoke. I watched several HOA board members look down at their folders. The same folders they had carried into every meeting. The same folders that had made them feel protected. Vicky leaned forward. Maintenance records prove the community invested in this road. The inspector nodded. They prove investment. He paused. They do not prove ownership. That was the first crack. Not a dramatic explosion. Just a simple sentence that changed the meaning of everything. Then Daniel stepped forward with his measurements. He placed 2 maps on the table. The first was the original county access map. The second was the Pine Ridge community map. At first glance, they looked almost identical. Then Daniel pointed to the highlighted sections. The county access corridor ends here. His finger moved across the paper. The HOA map extends the claimed road boundary approximately 14 feet into private property. The room went quiet, because now the argument was no longer about opinions. It was about a line, a real line, a measured line, the same line they had covered with asphalt. Vicky immediately pushed back. That map was created to represent the community access area. Daniel looked at her. Then why does it include land outside the recorded access corridor? She didn't answer. Instead, she turned toward the county reviewer. This is just a technical disagreement. But technical details were exactly what had brought us here. The next piece came from the camera, the one mounted beside the gate, the one I almost ignored. The inspector pulled up the installation record. March 14th. Then he placed it beside the HOA project announcement. March 28th. The camera existed 2 weeks before the community was told the project existed. A few people exchanged looks, because that meant someone had been preparing before the neighborhood knew there was a problem. Vicky crossed her arms. We installed security because the entrance was being improved. The inspector looked back at the dates. Before the improvement project was announced. Silence. Then came the final piece. The access agreement from Thomas Whitaker. The document that had been sitting quietly for decades. The one that gave Pine Ridge permission to use the road. Not own it. Use it. The county reviewer read the final paragraph slowly. The agreement grants access rights only. He looked up. There is no transfer of title. That sentence landed harder than anything else. Because every other piece had been a question. This was the answer. The gate. The sign. The assessment. The camera. The expanded road. They were all built on the same mistake. Vicky tried one more time. Everyone understood what this road was. The inspector closed the folder. Understanding is not ownership. Nobody argued after that. The room felt different. The same neighbors who had stopped waving at me were now looking at the documents instead of me. They weren't angry anymore. They were confused. Because the story they had believed for months was falling apart right in front of them. The county completed the review 2 weeks later. The official finding was issued on a Friday morning. The road had never been transferred to Pine Ridge Estates. The HOA's claim of ownership was rejected. and the county ordered an immediate halt to all HOA actions representing the road as community-owned infrastructure. The gate stayed standing for now. The sign stayed hanging, but the power behind them was gone. For the first time since the asphalt machines arrived, I drove past that entrance knowing something had changed. They still had the metal. They still had the pavement. But they no longer had the story. And without the story, they had nothing left to stand on. The first thing they removed was the sign. Not the gate. Not the pavement. The sign. The same polished metal sign that had been hanging there since the morning I smelled hot asphalt and watched my private road disappear under someone else's decision. A county worker arrived early on a Monday with a ladder, a toolbox, and a printed order attached to a clipboard. I stood near the driveway with Megan while he unscrewed the words. Pine Ridge Estates Community Access Road. The metal scraped against the bolts. The sound was small, almost ordinary. But after everything that had happened, hearing that sign come down felt louder than the construction equipment that put it there. The gate stayed for a few more weeks while the county and HOA worked through the correction process. But it no longer controlled anything. The lock was removed. The camera was taken down. The security vehicle stopped coming. For the first time in months, nobody was watching my driveway. Nobody was checking whether I belonged on my own property. The road was just a road again. Vicky Harrow did not disappear overnight. She resigned from the HOA board after several residents demanded a leadership change. The same people who once told me to stop fighting were now asking how nobody had checked the ownership records before approving the project. I didn't celebrate when I heard. Honestly, I just felt tired. Vicky wasn't some cartoon villain. She made a series of decisions based on a belief that she had the authority to make them. The problem was that she kept choosing certainty over proof. And eventually, reality caught up. The financial damage took longer to repair. My construction company had to rebuild trust one customer at a time. I met with the client I lost and showed him the county findings, the records, and the timeline. He didn't apologize dramatically. He just looked at the documents and said, "I should have waited before believing rumors." A month later, he hired my company for another project. It wasn't the same contract, but it was a beginning. Daniel helped replace the damaged survey markers along the road. This time, the orange markers weren't hidden under fresh concrete. They stood exactly where they belonged. Visible, measured, verified. Thomas Whitaker came by when we finished. He walked slowly down the road, tapping his old boots against the gravel shoulder. "Looks like it survived," he said. I looked at the road. The pavement was still there. The gate was still there. The history was still there. But now everything had the right name. The county recorded the correction. The HOA updated its documents. The access agreement was preserved exactly as it had always been. Use, not ownership. That distinction had cost me months of stress, thousands of dollars, and a lot of sleepless nights. But it also reminded me why I bought the property in the first place. Not for a fight, for peace. A few weeks later, Megan and I sat on the porch after sunset. The same porch where we had watched the gate appear. The same porch where we wondered if staying was worth it. A truck drove slowly down the road. No security guard stopped it. No camera followed it. No one asked for permission. It was just a neighbor heading home. Megan looked at me and smiled. "Feels normal again." She was right. The strangest part was that the road itself had barely changed. The gravel was still beneath the pavement. The trees still lined the edges. The evening air still carried the same quiet sounds we loved when we first arrived. The only difference was that nobody was pretending it belonged to someone else. The orange survey marker caught the last bit of sunlight beside the road. Still there. Still mine. And for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly where I stood.